The following is a presentation of the Match Talk Podcast Network.
Defense Soap revolutionized athletic hygiene in 2005 with the introduction of a bar soap containing natural ingredients proven to be effective against skin infections common to wrestlers. Today, Defense Soap leads the world in sports hygiene innovation with a complete line of bar soaps, shower gels, and body wipes that contain high-grade tea tree, eucalyptus, and peppermint oils. Defense Soap. Defend what you have built at defensesoap.com. Hello, wrestling fans. It's time for the World Wrestling Resource Podcast. The World Wrestling Resource was made that you as a wrestler, parent, coach, or fan can have access to all the resources of the very best in the world of wrestling. I'm three-time wrestling writer and broadcaster of the year, Jason Bryant, and I want you to join me, along with John McGovern and world champions Terry Brands and Dennis Hall, as we talk training tips, topical discussion, mental preparation, and more on the World Wrestling Resource Podcast. World Wrestling Resource is sponsored by Defense Soap. Find World Wrestling Resource on Facebook at facebook.com/World Wrestling Resource and follow us on Twitter at WWRESO. And, of course, on the web at worldwrestlingresource.com. Now on to the show as we join John McGovern, Terry Brands, and Dennis Hall. World Wrestling Resource returning as the international season heating up. We've had some big events coming off the Yasser Dogu in Turkey. We've had the Commonwealth Games a couple weeks ago, actually at this point a couple months ago in Gold Coast, Australia. We'll talk a little bit about that today with our guest, Lúcás Ó'Ceallacháin, the the interim high-performance director of Wrestling Canada Loot. And Lúcás has been around the sport of wrestling since 2013, has a big sports background. Last time we talked to him was on the Short Time Wrestling podcast back in September of 2015. Lúcás, been a while since we've chatted. How have you been? And welcome to the Northern Hemisphere of North America.
Well, thanks for having me on, neighbor. And that's with a U, just to spell it the wrong way, just to wind you up a bit. It's been good. It's been a lot has changed, I guess, since we last spoke. A lot of things for the better, I think, as well, just generally around the sport. It's been busy and obviously delighted to be up here in Canada now.
And you say neighbor like it's a joke, but seriously, you're in Ottawa right now, which is in Ontario. And I am in Minnesota, which also borders Ontario. But you have to go around a bunch of lakes. So I could actually drive due north and be in the same province as you. I mean, but can we talk to the Canadians about at least making smaller provinces or at least more state-like so us Americans can understand it?
Yeah, I'm not sure how that'll go down. I'll let you talk to them about that. I just arrived, so they still like me, so I'm going to stay that way. Yeah,
because you've already started using the you in words like favorite and neighbor. Oh, man. Leave it up to an Irishman to screw up the Queen's English. No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so speaking on that, you have a sports background. You're Irish by birthright and by accent. And just talk a little bit about how you got into sports in general and what drew you to kind of the sports management type of world.
Yeah, it's so originally I was on a very different track in my career. So I was a linguist. So I did Russian at university, and I grew up speaking different languages, Irish and English, and Irish is a different language, by the way. So I mean Gaelic, Irish, and French. So I was kind of in that space of pursuing linguistics, and maybe thought like something like international business or something long term. But I'd always been involved in sport, playing rugby, and just one thing led to another, and this kind of weird niche combination of rugby and Russian was pretty unusual. So I had a couple of opportunities come up while I was studying Russian overseas to get involved in rugby overseas, both as a player and then as a coach. And then I could see kind of gaps in the sport management side with the teams that I was involved with. And that just kind of naturally led me into taking on roles and just rolling my sleeves up and getting stuck in because things needed to be done for the team. And as you start learning by experience, you start to feel where the gaps are in your knowledge as well. So I ended up ditching the linguistics track and heading down a series of qualifications for sport management, everywhere from coaching, refereeing, all the way through to strength and conditioning, sports psychology, and eventually doing a master's in sports management. And through that, I guess, I had great opportunities because of that niche, that Russian language and rugby. I had a lot of good opportunities that maybe other people wouldn't have had. Both good and bad, I have to say. Sometimes it helps to not speak Russian, and sometimes it's fantastic to be able to speak Russian. So took full advantage, I would say, of the opportunities. And then with the sport management background, that pulled me into some other sports. So did some time with Special Olympics. I did some time with rugby back in Ireland, but then also with Olympic handball, team handball, which I really, really enjoyed. And then made a switch into wrestling, which I haven't really looked back from. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, you mentioned the Russian. This is something for years. Actually, my mom got me all 5 levels of Rosetta Stone for my birthday one year because in 2009 at the World Championships in Denmark, I ended up at in wonderful Herning, Denmark. I was in an elevator at the Hotel Scandic with one Mikhail Mamashvili and Alexander Karelin. I really wanted to know what they were saying. So I told myself then, man, I want to be that guy that knows Russian, but doesn't let anybody else he knows Russian. Of course, I'm letting the world know that I wanted to be that guy. But so I got the Rosetta Stone. I'm midway through lesson 1. I'm like, this is gonna suck. So in terms of just learning the language and being kind of a what's the word? If you're a linguist, you're like what a language phobe. What's the word I'm looking for? A file, or I don't know what it is. But how do you go about learning such a dynamic language that's got a lot of different letters that we're not used to seeing in the modern Latin alphabet?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to wonder how much space was in that elevator with the Karel and Mamiashvili and you. And
I was pretty portly at the time too, so not much. And those European elevators, they are not big.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that in Finland they've got some pretty pokey little elevators. Going back to the Russian, yeah. So I guess one of the things I'm not actually very good with grammar, and people find that quite hard to believe because I speak a few different languages. But I'm very much like a parrot. So I hear stuff and I repeat it and keep going until I get it right. But I found that necessity is the mother of invention. So when it comes to languages and you're an athlete and you want the ball, you very quickly learn the words for "give me the ball." And when the guys don't give you the ball, you learn the bad words to make sure you get the ball. So that was kind of one of the things that helped. And recently, actually, I saw that Vicky Anthony started to learn Russian as well. And one of the tips I gave her was find some music that you like that's in Russian and try and listen to it, or a cartoon or something easy. Because sometimes, you just get a tune stuck in your head and you start to hear the words and so I know a lot of really bad Russian pop music, and that helped a lot as well. So yeah, I'm not really a bookworm. I don't really enjoy, like, the grammar is complicated in Russian, but it's just consistency, And after a while, you immerse yourself in it and you start to recognize things, and it just becomes that little bit easier. But it's a lot of practice, and it's not easy when you start off, especially with the pronunciation and stuff like that. But you get there in the end.
And you also said necessity, and you spent 8 years in Kazakhstan, which is still a country that speaks a lot of Russian, even though maybe a common misconception is that all the former Soviet republics are Russian speaking. I mean, how true is that? And then going back to the first part of the question, how quickly did assimilating into Kazakhstan have to force you into the Russian?
Yeah, well, like one of the other necessities was that my wife is from Kazakhstan, so she speaks much better English than I do, by the way. So really had to try and kind of get to grips with Russian to try and communicate with her friends and family and stuff like that. That was important for me. But I think that when you travel around the former Soviet Union and those new countries, there's definitely a generational gap now. So like if you go to somewhere like Azerbaijan, for example, a younger audience there, they really don't speak that much Russian. Some people do, some people don't. And then there's also a big political thing, so people react differently. Some people are very happy to speak Russian with you just to be able to communicate with somebody who's visiting. And then on the other hand, people just don't want to speak Russian, so even though they might speak it, they don't want to. So I've had some mixed experiences, especially in places like Azerbaijan and even in Finland. Actually, I had a funny experience where I got lost, and there's a lot of Russians in Finland, and the bus driver spoke Russian, and he was able to help me out. So it comes in handy even in outside those countries. But I think in Kazakhstan as well, one of the big things in our team that I played with was use of Kazakh language as well. So like alongside Russian, Kazakh has a very strong position, and knowing enough to know that somebody's an ethnic Kazakh versus Kazakhstani is a big point. And if you know that somebody's an ethnic Kazakh and you greet them in Kazakh, you can pretty easily switch into Russian afterwards. But if you greet them in Russian first, sometimes it doesn't go down well. So it's just knowing the cultural norms there as well, and that really helps. It's a bit like Quebec up here, trying to figure out should you say bonjour or hello, but you get there in the end.
And that experience, and it goes into wrestling. You were picked up by United World Wrestling in 2014, late 2013, into 2014. I think we first met in Tashkent, if I'm not mistaken. Of all places to remember meeting somebody, it's the karaoke capital of Central Asia. It is Tashkent, Uzbekistan. And when that role opened up, there have been a lot of staff additions to United World Wrestling, a new branding element, new website. You got an actual media team. There's rankings, and when you get brought on board, first of all, how did wrestling approach you, and what made you want to jump at the challenge here? Because it was right after we lost wrestling in the Olympics, and then it came back, and we've got a lot of repairing and soothing to do in that era.
Yeah, I think around that time I probably reached out to, as it was then, Fila. Through a connection I had with somebody who knew Lalovich, and just said, look, if these guys need help, I'd be interested to talk to them about kind of what they want to do. And then went and met with Lalovich and had a conversation with him about where they were and where they were hoping to go. And it was a really interesting and exciting time, because the sky was the limit, really, in a way, because it was they were back on the program, but they'd made all these promises that they had to make a lot of changes. And so it meant that there was a kind of a clear path to make big changes for the good of the sport, with very little resistance, because, and I say that with a pinch of salt. I mean, the resistance was definitely there, but more freedom to actually get things done because of, this kind of dark cloud hanging over the sport. So people were much more willing to engage with new ideas and get involved in them. And also, without upsetting anybody, I think the bar was quite low in terms of what they'd done previously with development and that space. So when I came in, it was very much a case of, well, we haven't done any of these things. Where do you want to start? And that's exciting. When you can go into any organization in sport and somebody says, we need to start from zero. What can you come up with? That's pretty exciting, because in some of the other sports I'd worked in previously, it was always a challenge of, well, we've always done it this way for the last 50 years. We can't change. We don't have a budget. We don't have the influence to do something like that. Whereas with wrestling, it was a case of, look, we have limited resources, but you're allowed to apply them as needed. And that was pretty exciting. And there was a good young team being put together there as well, which was great. So, you mentioned the media team and even the competition team, that they've done amazing work to try and bring wrestling up to the standard where it is now. And I think people can see the change. If you think back to how bad Tashkent was and what a disaster it was for some people, now when you can see the difference at, say, some of the big tournaments, like Paris, if you compare Paris to Tashkent, it's night and day. And I think that goes back to all the hard work that was done by the staff. And they don't often get the credit, but I think they deserve it for turning those things around.
Yeah, and even as an American, knowing that 2015 was a great World Championships in Las Vegas, I mean, 2017 in Paris was just, from my position as one of the English-speaking announcer, in there on the floor in the venue, amazing. Like, everything I needed was taken care of, and it wasn't like I have got these hoity-toity, I need this in my room. I need that. It's just everything was as it should have been. It's like walking into the Division I championships, minus the barrier in language, and saying, no, I'm supposed to go here, and you have to show the badge. But I thought the French did an amazing job, and I think they would have done an amazing job even if they were not in contention for an Olympic bid. But Paris was great. Of course, Rio, that was another series with the Olympics, and we'll talk about how Olympic-style festivals and things are run here in a bit. But I also wanted to point out one thing that you brought to the development with United World Wrestling was the Super 8. And it's kind of fitting that I watched a documentary today that was produced by the CBC on women's wrestling in Canada called Sweat Equity. So that's something that seemed to be right up your wheelhouse. Did you know that was coming out before you got the position there in Canada? And how did that tie into what you were doing with United World Wrestling in that era?
Yeah, that's I've seen the trailer for the Sweat Equity piece, and I'm excited to watch the full version. Definitely with coming to Canada, I think a lot of the attraction was around their women's program, which is super strong. And through the Super 8, I had a chance to work with people like Carol Wynn, who's one of the next generation coaches here in Canada. And Carol's story, just on a human level, is really inspirational. And when you connect with people like that kind of gets you excited about the possibility to collaborate with them. I'll be fully upfront, knowing that Tanya Verbeek is involved as the lead coach, but also that the office has people like Tamara, who for a long time has been running the office of Wrestling Canada. There's some fantastic women involved in the program, and Canada has that reputation for having a great approach when it comes to women involved in sport. On the flip side of that, the men's program has this amazing tradition as well, and I think people forget about that when they think about Canada. And the big challenge is bringing those two things together. This really strong women's program that can help to bring up the men's program back to the place where it was, and it's getting that balance, and that's kind of what's exciting about the challenge. And then there's phenomenal talent there in terms of the athletes that we have. So I'm excited to work with them and just kind of get out of their way and let them get on with it, because they're so talented. They just need the environment to thrive, and that's kind of what my role is going to be.
Yeah, and you got Greco Joe Dasho down here in Minnesota trying to carry the Greco-Roman flag for Canada all by himself, it seems.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, they're definitely they're probably the most unloved of the three disciplines, but there's always room for all disciplines. We have to try and work together. And like personally, I have a great appreciation for Greco. When it's done well, it's amazing. And that's kind of been nurtured through my time in wrestling with people, spending a lot of time with people like Momir Petkovic and Ivan Ivanov on the Bulgarian bags. Those guys are so passionate about Greco that you can't help have some of it rub off on you. And hopefully we can even see some Greco in the future as well.
You and I had a conversation in Gold Coast about one of your colleagues at United World Wrestling, Ncaa. Vorontsov, I believe is how you say his name, and he's been part of the developmental program and the coach's education, and you guys have been hand in hand in a lot of that stuff. And some of the things that Andre did behind the scenes that really hadn't been talked about. I mean, what did a guy like that bring to not just the sport of wrestling, but to the entire international federation?
Yeah, he's a pretty unique character, and actually went to Brock here in Canada as well. So he's one of the guys that probably influenced my decision, because I saw kind of what Brock did for him and his whole career. I think one of the big things when I arrived at United World Wrestling was there were no wrestlers involved, like on the staff or in the team. I'd say with the exception of like Tim Foley, who was a wrestler but was kind of on the outside because he was working remotely, and so it was a big challenge to try and get wrestling expertise, even with all these new ideas, which were quite good. You didn't often have somebody to bounce them off who really knew wrestling. So when I started to build my team of people around the world, I made a big point of only hiring wrestlers and getting wrestlers involved. And finding wrestlers that had the skills that we wanted was kind of a challenge. So you were, the typical format of when you bring a wrestling expert is, I won 6 Olympic medals, or I'm a 5-time world champion, so I'm going to be awesome at whatever I do. And they don't understand that sometimes that is not the guy that you want to send to teach wrestling in Sierra Leone or something like that, So we had all these amazing champions involved, but with no other skills than they were phenomenal wrestlers. And that's probably a very harsh summary of it, but that was more or less what I walked into. So I needed probably some more malleable young wrestling minds that were willing to kind of to work with the new ideas and find a way to do it. And Andre kind of came to us through an internship, and with his Ukrainian Canadian connections, I was able to check out who this guy is. So I asked the Canadians, and they said, yeah, he's a good kid, he's really enthusiastic, he's a good wrestler, he's got good knowledge, good skills. And Ukraine came back saying, vouched for him, said he's done some really good things in Ukraine as well. So when we brought Andre on board, he was incredibly intense. Like he won't mind me telling you this, but incredibly intense and incredibly direct, like very Ukrainian, very much,
My
yes,
grandmother's
no.
Ukrainian, so yes, I know exactly
Yeah,
what you're talking about.
yeah. So with all the good things that come with that, but also with that directness that we had to kind of refine a little bit. But he's been phenomenal in just taking the ball and running with it. So sometimes we'd say to him, listen, there's nobody else that can go. You got to go tomorrow and you got to go teach this course. Can you do it? And it was never a problem for him. He'd just jump on a plane and go. And I think in his first, maybe his second week with us, he went to Congo for the African Games to run a training camp with Vincent Ncaa, who's another one of the stars of that development team. And you know, they just connected right away and they did a phenomenal job in unbelievably trying circumstances. I mean, this will give you an idea. They arrived and the wrestling mats for the competition had been stolen by the Boxing Federation. So they had to go and get the mats back with a crew of wrestlers. So that's the kind of craziness that they would deal with on a regular basis. But I think the big thing with Andre was he was able to get the whole methodology of coach education and our approach, and he brought that to places as diverse as North Korea, Vietnam, and he just has that great personality that people connect with now. He's got a great smile, a good sense of humor, and he's kind of learned not to take himself too seriously, which is really important when you're working across cultures like North Korean culture or Thai or even Congo. You need to be able to find other ways to communicate with people than just language. And wrestling has been that language for him, and his passion for wrestling just it spills over into everything he does. So yeah, he was an amazing find, and he's done some great things, and I've always been happy to work with guys like him.
One thing I want to touch on again, we've briefly mentioned the media operations, and Gordon Templeman's a guy that's also been kind of overseeing a couple different hats, and he's had to grow that staff, of course, with Tim Foley, who many Americans here know through his highly, I guess, I wouldn't say controversial, but maybe polarizing at times column on Intermat, the Foley's Friday Mailbag. But one thing that you're seeing a lot more press come out, you're seeing releases, you're seeing things that are from, and let's look at it from your perspective with a sports management background. How important are those media elements to an international federation, to a sport as a whole? I mean, how did you see what wrestling was doing or wasn't doing that rugby was doing well, and be like, yeah, you know what, we need to do something about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have a lot of respect for Tim, and I know he has strong opinions, but that's why I respect him so much. He's done a really good job of kind of bringing the standard up there. Gordon as well. I mean, like same thing. When he came in, there was nothing. There was really nothing there. There was TV rights deals that had been done like 30 years previously, and nobody knew where the contract was or where to start. So it was really starting on the back foot. So to see things like the rebrand or the color of the mats or even the singlets, things that seemed impossible at the time, to see those just as a given now is incredible, because the amount of work that we had to put in together helping people to convince them that hey, it's a good idea to change the singlet, and people said no, we can't do it, it's impossible, you just can't do it, nobody will understand what's going on. And I mean, it's actually worked out pretty well. There's been some pretty dodgy singlets out there as well.
Nobody's going to understand what's going on. Must we remind you of the 011010 binary code of wrestling, the ball draw era? Nobody knew what was going on there.
There's some crazy things. So, and sometimes you can't get a different perspective because you're so involved in your sport. And I would probably be the same when it comes to rugby. But when you come from a different sport and you're bringing those things in, it's kind of easier to get a reference point. And there's things that are unique to wrestling that wrestling does phenomenally well, and then there's other things that are just needed work and needed some improvement. And I guess you have to benchmark against those other sports. And rugby is a huge sport in a way, but I would look at something like gymnastics. How many followers do they have online? How many tweets do they put out? Do they put out press releases? How engaged are they with their audience? Is it their athletes that are driving it, or is it the organization? And if you compare where wrestling started to where it is now, they've just clawed back so much of that ground. And the content they're putting out is excellent. Like I look forward to things like Big Move Monday or the wrap ups that they have online, and it's the content that the fans want. And I think they've listened to fans and tried to give them what they want. So I think that's been incredible to see the change. On my side of things, when I was working there, was very much around coach education and just the whole approach to coaching. And even now, that's an approach that I think a lot of wrestling coaches struggle with because of the transition from, most coaches just go from being an athlete into being a coach, and they do pretty much what they were taught. So they don't get a lot of time, and there's not a lot of top paid jobs in wrestling. That's the other thing that actually would encourage you to go and get like a really strong education in coaching. So Canada is one of probably the exceptions where the coaches are really highly qualified in terms of coaching skills. But that was one of the big things that really stood out for me was you just go to a wrestling practice, you see how it would run, how it would be organized. And I think one of the biggest things that I noticed was, wrestlers kind of forgot how to have fun. Like it's an incredibly fun sport at the heart of it. There's so many games that kids do when they're playing, and that kind of struck a chord with me when I was in Africa, in places like Senegal, where kids just play wrestling. They don't play soccer or they don't play rugby. They play wrestling, and they'll wrestle everybody. They'll just walk up to you and want to wrestle you, and they have really basic rules and lots of games to do it, and they smile and they laugh about it, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And then you would go to somewhere like Georgia and you would say to the guys, hey, can you teach this technique and try and make it fun for kids that want to be involved in wrestling? And they would say, wrestling is not fun and games. So, you have to try and strip it back to how do we keep people involved in the sport? How do we keep them excited about it? And wrestling is an incredibly tough sport. I honestly don't think I've worked in a tougher sport, and I add rugby into that mix because in rugby, you've got guys like me who are fast and pretty, but not very tough. And then you have guys that are super tough in rugby as well, but I'm not one of them. But in wrestling, you have to be incredibly resilient, incredibly durable. And I think it was, I'm trying to remember who said it to me. Maybe it was Helen or Adeline from the States that told me, it's one of those sports where you have to lose so much when you start off to get any good at it at all. You go and play soccer, everybody can kick a ball. You might not be able to kick it well, but you can kick it. But when you go to wrestling, you don't know technique and you can't really enjoy it as much. That's really challenging, and it's challenging to keep people involved in the sport. And that was one of the big areas that I tried to focus in on was, if coaching is better and the room is a better environment to be in, kids will enjoy it more and they'll stay there. And I think an amazing example of that is Ivan and the Suplex guys. Like how they coach in their club, how they run their practices, how the kids respond to them. It's a very ideal scenario in terms of practice. And those guys are tigers. I mean, the techniques that they have, they're incredible young athletes, but the enjoyment they get out of it is second to none.
Making it exciting was something that you go into the Commonwealth Games in a country like Australia that doesn't have a great wrestling tradition, and you are the wrestling manager. First off, how did you get sucked in from United World Wrestling to go, you know what, we're going to send you down to the Gold Coast of Australia, and you get to hang out here for about a year or so and plan this wrestling event? I mean, how did that all materialize for you?
Yeah, I think, we worked incredibly hard in the lead up to Rio, and I have to admit, like, I found Rio very challenging in terms of, all of the things that happened at Rio. And as a result, I was kind of a little bit, my energy was a little bit down after the games, even though we'd done some phenomenal things. And I was kind of looking around to see what I would do next. Would I stay? Would I go? And an opportunity came up with the Commonwealth Games where they didn't have anybody in place at the time. And so I had a conversation and said, well, look, I'd like to go and try and then see what happens further down the track if I come back or I don't come back. And as it turns out, I didn't go back. But it was just the chance to, expand my skill set as well. So I'd very much, put all the tools in place for the development programs, and they were running pretty well. So it was a good time to maybe take a chance on something a little bit different. And then the thought of, living on the beach in Australia for just over a year and a half, I surf in my free time, and my wife's a big surfer as well. So that was a big draw. So I thought, okay, it's a good lifestyle change, it's a good job, and it'll definitely be one of those major games where I can, be in control of the environment. I think after Rio, it was a good chance to get that sense of control of the environment. So I'd done the coaching side, the athlete side, and worked in with that a lot. And I knew as well what made athletes crazy when they go to an event, especially wrestling events, and coaches as well. So I thought, okay, if I can go with that athlete-centered approach about how can we make this event better for the athletes, then I think I can do a good job. And as it turned out, I think we did a reasonably good job. There weren't any major dramas. There was a couple of small things, but they weren't necessarily under our control. So I'm happy enough with how it turned out.
Yeah, we get down there to Gold Coast, and there was no Greco, just men's and women's freestyle. And people look at the wrestling countries. India has really made a real push, especially in the women's side. I actually watched Dangle on the way over on the plane, and then the Canadian women, of course. But we're also seeing these new countries emerge. We had the great story of Kevin Wallen from Jamaica, 48 years old, out there wrestling. I mean, these type of tournaments, you're not going to typically see that at the World Championships. But what was the most fulfilling part about, firing up the first whistle at the Commonwealth Games, and then, hearing the last anthem for the last time, knowing that, okay, wrestling's over, my job is done?
Yeah, I think, it was, I really wanted Australia to do well, but they had a lot of challenges to get their program up to that standard. Because, you have India, Nigeria, Canada that are very strong. And then you have, South Africa, for example, pulling a good performance out of the hat and doing good things there. So, this was probably one of the few tournaments where I was less invested in individual athletes. Because in Rio, we had 114 scholarships in the lead up to Rio, and each scholarship would have come across my desk when I was at United World Wrestling. So I knew every single athlete, intimately in terms of, what the expectation would be. From a competition point of view, it was just when that first match started, and things got going. And actually, when you announced the first match and the first athletes came to the mat, it was phenomenal, because we'd put a year and a half of planning from my side into it, down to every detail. And no matter how much you plan, things always come up that will just, be a spanner in the works on the day. But thankfully, it went off pretty smooth. Kevin Wallen, for me, that was one of the great stories of the games, because he was just a phenomenal character. And I loved how he interacted with the crowd. But he almost didn't make the weigh-in, which was hilarious, because we ran this really well-organized weigh-in, and we wanted to make sure that, you did your weigh-in and your medical at the same time, and it would be over very fast. And every athlete had gone through except for Jamaica, and I started to panic. Where's the Jamaican guy? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? And as he arrived, the referee's delegate told him, "Hey, you're late." And he said, "I am from Jamaica. I'm right on time." And he just stepped on the scales, and he just kept smiling for the rest of the tournament. And that guy, I mean, he had an incredible experience. And when you see what he's going to bring back to Jamaica, and how excited he is to kind of share wrestling, I think that's just it's the beauty of the sport of wrestling is, a guy like that, and the origin story he has behind him. He's going to do amazing things in Jamaica, and I was really happy that you got a chance to interview him and learn more about him.
Yeah, he spent some time up there north of the border in Canada too. Yeah, that was one of those things where I see this guy's like, I added him on Facebook. I'm like, I handed him my cards. Like, I want to talk to you like as soon as I get back, because I didn't have a chance to interview him there. I did talk to Larry Papadatos from Australia. And what was your interaction like with the National Federation there in Australia? Because again, not the deepest of wrestling tradition there. Not a whole lot of worldwide events take place. You might have an Oceanic Championships here or there, but in terms of hosting a games where there are much more popular sports in Australia and the Oceanic regions than wrestling. I mean, what was it like working with that international federation and getting things and the volunteers that knew enough to know where to go and how to basically lead people down the right aisle?
Yeah, we were fortunate, I think, in a lot of things came together nicely for us. One is having worked at the International Federation, it's very easy to pick up a phone and ask a question. So if I need to find out How far should the mat be from the edge of the platform, or do we want two cameras for the challenge or one? I could just pick up the phone and ask somebody. So that was great. And I don't think a lot of sport managers would have that luxury. So that was great. Then on the other side, I was able to bring a team together of people. So Andre was one of the guys I brought in, but equally Louise Minchin, who's not a wrestler, but worked on the Asian Indoor Martial Arts Games in Turkmenistan, which you can imagine with all the traditional styles and everything in there, the stress that she'd been under at that competition.
Yeah,
so
you were in Kazakhstan for 8 years. She was in, Turkmenistan for like a year or two?
Yeah. So she'd run all the crazy styles. So forget about freestyle or Greco. We're talking belt wrestling, Alish, all these guys. So she'd been involved with that. So this was going to be easy for her, coming back to Australia, and she's Australian. But then also Eli Manu, who's a wrestler from the island of Tokelau in Oceania, and Tiarn Raymond, who was a non-wrestler but an Iron Woman from Australia who worked in with us. And so I had a really good young event team who they followed direction really well, but they were also really good at just taking the initiative and owning their areas. And they were used to working in much more stressful environments. So just to give you a bit of context, Com Games is about 150 athletes, and it's a 3-day competition. You compare that to a world championship with like 1,000 athletes and 8 days of competition. It's a much more manageable event. And we had 2 years to plan it, So when you think of some of the competitions in wrestling that you've been to and you wonder how much planning has gone in and how early those events get awarded, you can appreciate, the benefit of just having that time to map everything out. And volunteers as well. I mean, we had some amazing volunteers that were involved in the Glasgow Commonwealth Games that traveled down and got involved again. And then we had some really incredible technical officials from Australia. So people like Geordie and Jess Lavers McBain, who were just great at just getting stuck in and, whatever they needed to do, they would do it. I had people come from, like one of our volunteers, Emma Twigg, is a rower. She's an Olympian. She came from New Zealand and volunteered. So there were some amazing people involved, and some local people as well that just, had no wrestling background or knowledge, but they did a great job. And sometimes at these big events, it's better when you don't know wrestling because you just trust, what you get told. You say coaches can't stand there. Okay. And whereas if you say that to wrestling people, they'll say, yeah, but sometimes he can. And, I know that guy and it's all right. It's his wrestler that's wrestling. So let's just let him stand there and say, no, he can't stand there. So there was definitely a good team that came together to deliver it. And, a good sign of that was that by the second day, I really wasn't doing anything. Like if I'm perfectly honest, I was just sitting back and watching and letting the team run it. So that's a good sign when the competition manager can take a seat. And I actually ended up watching one of the matches with Prince Edward from the royal family and Dave Gravenberg, who's a former wrestler, who's the CEO of the Commonwealth Games. So that's an excellent sign that you can just take a moment, watch the matches, enjoy the wrestling, and let your team do all the hard work.
Yeah, you're talking about people that didn't know a whole lot about wrestling. The production team I worked with, through Great Big Events, is the director was a film director. And he's looking at things not through the eye of a wrestling person. He's looking through it from the eye of what's this going to look like on television? What's this going to look like to the sports fan who's watching it? And that might actually have played to your point that the shots were great. After about a session, like, hey, don't cut away from this here. This is where you need to focus in on. So, actually being able to teach people how to do it was pretty cool on my perspective as well. And you talk about one of the friendliest crews I've ever worked with too. That was also great. I mean, we talked about how great Paris was. I tell you what, I loved Gold Coast.
Yeah, it was a great place for the athletes. I mean, in terms of like, you've got the beach, you've got the sea. One person that I did forget to mention in that list, and unfortunately he's not with us anymore, is Daniel Robin, who was our technical delegate. And people who know or knew Daniel in wrestling, he was a difficult character. Like, I'm not going to lie.
I announced with him in Rio. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, he was high maintenance. But you know what? For a guy who's been around wrestling for so long, he kind of earns it. So like some people can be the diva because they've earned it. So but I actually found him really, really supportive and really great to work with. And he always had my back, whenever we had to go and argue for things, why we need this for wrestling. And, he would always be the bad cop when I didn't want to be. So, yeah, I was really sad when I heard that he passed away not long after the games. And, he did a phenomenal things for wrestling. And he's always, even when he's difficult, it was usually his passion that was just getting the better of him. So, and he's somebody that like I've been involved with him the whole time I've been in wrestling. So he's a guy I would have trusted very well. And I was sad to hear about his passing.
Yeah, working with him in Rio was definitely an experience I'll never forget. So we're at the Commonwealth Games. We're much more cordial. So we weren't sitting next to each other for 6 straight days.
Yeah, that'll bring it out, won't it? Yeah.
Well, especially when you're next to a guy like me who never shuts up, as many of my friends and my wife also knows about. Now, moving forward, the games are over, and Canada is in a position where they had a high performance director. I believe it was Alex Davidson was his name prior, as a swimmer who was in that role, and I'd had a conversation with him or two over the years about how does a swimmer work with high performance in wrestling, and it's a little different. A title might be a little deceptive for those who are not really familiar with what the position is, but what is the position, and what was really the enticement to say, what, I'll take this as interim is still on the name. So one, how long term is it, and two, what does this position really do for you, and what can you do for Wrestling Canada, Luke?
Yeah, I think for the moment it's just playing it by ear and seeing how things go. They had a vacancy that they needed to fill for a period of time, so I agreed to get involved. The reason I was interested in it was, I think I mentioned it earlier, was just some of the people from Wrestling Canada that I've met are definitely the most professional people that I've met in wrestling. So I mentioned Tamara, who's the executive director, and she's just somebody that she was on a couple of committees and things like that in United World Wrestling, and somebody that just struck me as being very professional and very, very much clued into getting that balance between the traditions of wrestling and modernizing things. And then the coaches as well. I think Tanya being there, you've got a 3-time Olympic medalist who's leading the program. That's exciting, and she's a young coach. She's dynamic, and she's open to new things. And then the coaches that are supporting her and working with her, like people like Marty Calder and Paul Ragusa and Dave McKay, and even the Montreal coaches as well, people like Martine Dugrenier. So I've had the benefit of being able to meet most of those coaches at competitions. So they're people that I know and have a relationship with. So I'm kind of happy to collaborate with them. And then athletes as well, people like Javon Balfour and Erica Weeb. I've bumped into them at competitions all over the place, and they just strike me as, I would say, like good people first, and that's kind of what I look for when I'm looking to work with people is, are there good people involved, and what are they hoping to do? And at the moment, the position, I guess, is more about on the management side to make sure that the program is managed correctly and has the resources it needs, and those resources are limited, so we have to allocate them carefully. And it's also just a time where there's been a lot of change in Canadian wrestling generally, and it's kind of a time to steady a few things there. So that's kind of what I'm focused on for the next while, and we'll see how things go. And like I said, just excited to work with them. Some really good people here.
Yeah, up north of the border, their collegiate programs are freestyle, so the women's and men's programs work side by side with the clubs there. We've had several Canadians on this program and other programs explaining how that system works. One thing I do want to backtrack on is a little bit is your trip to the NCAA championships a couple years ago. I want to get your perspective on that, because we never really had a chance to talk about that at length. And when you see something from the international level, and that, okay, we've got 3 mats, we've got there's walkouts, there's pageantry, there's you got to say it in a couple languages. What were your first impressions of that first day at the NCAA Wrestling Championships? I want to say it was in St. Louis.
Yeah, it was in St. Louis, and I sat with Adeline Gray pretty much for the whole championship, so we were both as lost as each other, to be honest. Adeline tried to explain folk style rules to me, and I said, okay, wrestling's wrestling, and just as a sport, it was really hard to understand why people weren't scoring points. So I was like, we just did all this stuff, and there's no points. Whereas in freestyle or Greco, sometimes you do very little and you get a point. Oh, you push the guy out, there's a point, or you took him down, there's points. It's easier to follow sometimes. So folk style is, it's a real purist's one, and so I was kind of looking for those phrases that I could use to just kind of bluff my way through. So if you go to freestyle, it's always going to be blue passive, red passive. But if you go to folk style, you're looking for like stalling and all these things. But it was interesting to see how the atmosphere of the stadium was, because it's not two teams. It's so many different teams, so many different colleges, and this college hates that one, and these ones they get on well and they'll cheer for each other, but these ones they hate each other. And just in terms of how it actually ran as an event, I mean, it's an incredibly professionally run event, and a lot of the stuff that I tried to do in the Gold Coast when I was a competition manager was definitely taking a leaf out of the NCAA book, because just in terms of how they present and showcase the athletes, I think they do a phenomenal job of that. And how they've integrated technology into it as well. So things like the Jumbotron and the screens and the stats and the walkout stuff, when they go to the final matches, it's really a spectacle. And I think that's something that, United World Wrestling probably like going that direction and want to get there. And it's exciting to think what they can do. And then the other thing that's exciting as well, I think, like NCAAs, I think the year I was there's athletes that just stand out, and you see them and they catch your eye just for their pure athleticism. And I think Logan Stieber was one of the guys that year that was he was really eye catching. He did some phenomenal stuff, and it was great then to see that somebody like that then makes the grade internationally and is now in that system. So the other thing that drove me crazy was the amount of Irish names in the NCAA championships. So there's a Fitzpatrick versus O'Connell or whatever. And I'm thinking, man, if we could get these guys to wrestle for Ireland, maybe we'd have a good program. So there was some really good talent there, and it's just an interesting format of a competition.
You got one. His name was Alex Dolly, not exactly Irish, and his grandfather was born on the boat, as the story goes.
Yeah, and he got so close to getting a bronze medal at the Europeans. Like I think he tore his bicep. Alex will probably tell you himself. He basically tore his bicep, and a former Yugoslav doctor put a lot of deep heat on it and just said, "You'll be fine." And he wasn't fine. But there's some amazing talent. It's just it's a bit like the Mongolian system. They have so many good wrestlers, but there's limited spots internationally, and it's kind of sad to see that. There are limited opportunities after college for guys to continue wrestling, because there's just so many good athletes.
We'll keep tabs on what you're doing up there as I come back down to the NCAA championships anytime. I know I want to get back to Canada. I was up there in 2015 for their Olympic trials in Sherwood Park out there near Edmonton. Enjoyed it. Matter of fact, went up there, and next thing you know, I'm on TV up there. So it was a lot of fun. The Canadians have always treated me pretty well. I actually found Canada House at the Commonwealth Games, which was a house of brews, so it was perfect for me. Somebody who likes craft beer, and the craft beer place was Canada House. So I enjoyed Gold Coast for the reasons of the wrestling and my Canadian friends up north, and I live in a border state, so I'm South Canadian down here. But Lúcás and fans out there can follow what's going on with Wrestling Canada Loot at wrestling.ca. That's a pretty cool top-level domain that they have up there. It's just wrestling. That'd be like wrestling.com here in the States. Wrestling.ca or on Twitter at twitter.com/Wrestling Canada. Lúcás, anything else you'd like to add for the folks listening around the world, or maybe our feverish fan base down here in the United States?
Yeah, just that want to thank you for having me on. I mean, you're doing a great job of spreading the word about wrestling. And I know that even down in Australia, plenty of people listening into the shows, and it's great to have that content. One of the guys that I do want to kind of give a shout out to is the 5-point move guys for Greco. I think what they're doing is phenomenal for Greco-Roman wrestling, and I hope that they'll keep going and they'll get a bit of interest. It'd be phenomenal to see those young cadets and juniors that USA are producing do well in Greco, but not too well. We want to take some medals too. So we'll be friendly for now. But you're always welcome up here anytime, Jason. So look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, just tell the Border Patrol and the Boundary Waters. Nah, he's good. He's good. Good. Now, Tim Hand's getting getting some shout outs there from 5 Point Move. Just want to be clear. Those guys, it's just one guy. It's Tim Hand's labor of love, and then working guys like Dennis Hall into it. So Timmy's doing a good job, and glad to hear the support there. So again, Lúcás, I appreciate the time, and we're in the same, we're only one time zone apart now. So when I text you, it's not going to be like, wait 8 hours till you wake up. We're good to go here.
I'll be much more sociable. That's good.
All right, man. Take care.
Thanks, Jason.
Subscribe to the World Wrestling Resource Podcast by going to wwrpodcast.com and check it out on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spreaker, or wherever you find your podcasts. World Wrestling Resource at worldwrestlingresource.com.
This show is part of the Matt Talk Podcast Network. For more wrestling podcasts, head over to MattTalkOnline.com.